Okay, so let's kick off. I'm Steve Unger, I'm the moderator for this panel session. I'll just make a few remarks on the format before I hand over to my distinguished panelists. The subject is how to ensure effective content moderation whilst protecting freedom of expression. That's obviously a topical subject, particularly given the elections in the United States today, for example. The idea of the session is that I'll first ask Mark Bunting to summarise where we are in the UK at the moment, the background to the discussion in the UK about content moderation. I'll then broaden out the discussion and ask first Susan to give a transatlantic perspective, and then Maria to give a European perspective on essentially how one achieves this dual challenge of effective content moderation and protecting freedom of expression. And I'll then ask Gareth and Claire to talk from a practitioner's perspective, from a perspective of people who have to deal with the challenge day in, day out of turning theoretical policy into practical reality. So that's the way we'll run the session. I should say that, given that this is all about freedom of expression, the panelists are of course free to say anything they want, and I'll be interested in what they do actually say. They may completely ignore my guidance, that's fine. We will, once the initial discussions have been had, take questions. If you want to submit a question, I think you just hit the Q&A button and submit a question, and I will keep an eye on the Q&A box and farm those questions out to the panelists. So with that, over to Mark, please.
Thanks very much, Steve, and sorry to struggle to get myself off mute there. Hello, everybody. My name's Mark Bunting. I'm a director at Offcom, the UK's converged media and communications regulator. I am responsible for implementing regulation of video sharing platforms under the European AVMS directive in the UK. And I'm also leading Ofcom's work on how we would implement regulation of content platforms more generally if Ofcom is asked to regulate those services with respect to online harms under a legislative proposal, which I'll describe in a bit more detail. I know we've got quite an international audience today, so I thought a little bit of scene setting about Ofcom might be useful. Ofcom has been in existence since 2003. Its origins were in the 5 separate media and telecoms regulators that existed prior to 2003. Since then, Ofcom's main responsibilities have been in network regulation and in broadcasting regulation, but as more legislative proposals have come through with respect to online content regulation, Ofcom has picked up those responsibilities as well. And the government has said that it's minded to make Ofcom the regulator for online harms when legislation is passed in that area as well. Although Ofcom is not part of the UK government, and I'm not representing government policy here today, I thought it might be useful for me to provide a little bit of background about the online harms proposals in the UK initially, and then I can say a little bit about the regulation of video sharing platforms under the AVMS directive. So the online harms framework has been in place, in development, I should say, for about 18 months now. The government published a white paper in April 2019, which set out its expectations in this area. It then consulted on that white paper and published an initial response in February of this year. We're currently awaiting a full response to that consultation, which is expected to be published in the next few weeks. And that will provide more detail on the government's plans for legislation. The junior minister said recently that the government's current expectation was that it would bring forward draft legislation early in 2020. What is the online harms regulation going to be about? The government's proposal at its core is to introduce a new duty of care on services that allow sharing or discovery of user-generated content or interaction between users. And that duty is to have appropriate systems and processes in place to react to harmful and illegal content and to improve the safety of their users, with a particular focus on the safety of minors. The government's prompted, as many governments have been around the world, by growing concerns about the risks posed by harmful and illegal content online and by perceived shortfalls in the accountability of platforms for managing those harms. As I say, the requirement is on companies not to eradicate all forms of harmful content online, because I think the government is clear that that standard of perfection is not achievable in open online environments, or at least not without very disproportionate impacts on freedom of expression. So instead, the duty is to have proportionate systems that seek to protect users from the effects of harmful and illegal content online. So there are 3 points about the online harms framework that I really wanted to emphasize today. The first is that there are significant differences between online content regulation as it's envisaged in online harms and traditional content legislation in a broadcasting environment. Particularly, the regulator won't adjudicate on the acceptability or otherwise of individual items of content, nor will it consider individual complaints from users about items of content. And perhaps more importantly, the presence of harmful and illegal content on a platform is not in itself, in the government's proposals, evidence of a breach of the regulatory requirements. It's not sufficient evidence of a breach. It may be part of the evidential base that a regulator might draw on to determine whether a breach of requirements had taken place. But the requirements are to have adequate systems and processes to keep users safe, not a requirement to eliminate all forms of online harm. The second point I really wanted to draw out is that the government has said that its expectation is that the requirements on companies should be risk-based and proportionate. In particular, there's what the government has called a differentiated approach. And what that means is that while all companies are expected to act on illegal content and content that's harmful to minors, only the biggest platforms, the so-called tier 1 companies in the government's terminology, will have responsibilities with respect to content that may not be illegal, but may pose a risk of harm nonetheless. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a second. But more generally, it's an important principle, I think, in the government's publications to date, that the expectations of any particular company should be proportionate to the level of risk that are posed by its services, to the company's size, and to the resources available to the company. And therefore, it's not a one-size-fits-all set of requirements. The third thing about online harms that I really wanted to draw out is the very significant focus on transparency, particularly for this category of content, which is not illegal, but may be harmful. The expectations there are that the biggest companies will have clear terms and conditions, and they'll enforce those terms and conditions transparently and consistently. But the regulator won't define minimum standards with respect to legal but harmful content. Now, I should say at this point, this is based on the statements from the government, particularly in the response to its consultation published in February. This policy debate is continuing to move on. As I say, we haven't yet had the full response to the consultation. So when that appears, there may be some shift from this position, but that's the state of the proposals as we understand them today. Very briefly on freedom of expression, I think there are 3 levels of safeguard in the government's proposals. First is the general requirement on both companies and regulators to have regard to users' rights and to have a responsibility to protect users' rights online. And obviously that includes freedom of expression as well as privacy and other rights. Secondly, specifically, there'll be an opportunity for users to appeal and seek redress against content moderation decisions by companies. And thirdly, there'll be an oversight role for the regulator, particularly in scrutinising complaints and redress processes, but also more generally in assessing the efficacy of platforms' protective measures. And to our mind, that's likely to include having some regard to whether what platforms do in response to these regulations is unduly geared to content removal and ends up disproportionately removing content that was not in fact illegal or harmful. That's the online harms regime in a nutshell. Very happy to pick up questions about that later. I'll also talk briefly about where we are on video sharing platform regulation. This is a new set of regulations in the UK. The legislation was passed at the end of September. It's a result of transposing the 2018 European AVMS directive into UK law. It gives Ofcom powers to regulate UK-based platforms that allow sharing of video. And those platforms have to select appropriate measures from a list of tools that are described in the directive to protect all users from incitement to hatred and violence and illegal content, and also to protect minors from content that might be harmful to them. It's a much more limited regime because there will probably only be sort of low dozens of companies in the UK that operate video sharing services. So whereas the scope of online harms is very broad, potentially running into thousands of companies, the scope of the video sharing platform regime is much more constrained. However, what we're seeking to do in implementing those requirements is to take a broadly consistent approach to the approach that the government has set out for online harms. And that means that the primary responsibility for assessing the risk that companies' services pose will sit with companies themselves, as will the responsibility for developing an appropriate response to that risk. The regulator's role is to provide guidance to companies about appropriate protective measures, to supervise the actions they take in response, and to bring them into compliance with the requirements where we have evidence that the steps they're taking aren't sufficient to protect users. So that regulation is coming into force now. In fact, it took effect from the 1st of November. We've published an initial guidance document, which attendees who are interested might want to read on our website. That was published on the 21st of October. That provides some initial indications of how we expect to implement these requirements. We'll be working with industry for the next 6 to 9 months, helping to develop our guidance and to understand what companies are already doing and where we might expect them to do more in future. In that period, we will have powers to enforce, but we're likely only to do so where we think there are very significant breaches of the requirements, and therefore companies will have some time to get up to speed with the requirements and develop an appropriate response. That's all I wanted to say by way of introduction. I hope that hasn't gone on too long, Steve. As I say, very happy to take questions on any of that later.
That's very helpful. Thanks, Mark. And now over to Susan for a transatlantic perspective.
Thank you, Stephen. And thank the IIC for organizing this session this morning. I'm Susan Ness, former member of the Federal Communications Commission, and a distinguished fellow at both the Annenberg Public Policy Center at Penn and the German Marshall Fund. More important for this event, I convened a transatlantic high-level working group on content moderation and freedom of expression. You can find our final report, which is entitled Freedom and Accountability, a Transatlantic Framework for Moderating Speech Online. I believe the link will be provided to you and is there now for all panelists and participants. We formed this working group which was equally drawn from European and American players. It included legislators, government officials, tech execs, civil society leaders, and academics. We had different perspectives, but common goals. We formed it in response to legislation that was forming around the globe to address illegal and harmful content online, especially in the context of elections. Some laws skirted due process and chilled free expression. Our mission was to find a practical way to address hate speech, violent extremism, and disinformation without chilling free expression or further fracturing the internet. We recommended a flexible regulatory framework based on transparency instead of regulating content and enforced by robust accountability mechanisms. Our recommendations were designed to be adaptable on both sides of the Atlantic to reflect the different legal systems and social norms. But before I review the specific elements of our framework, why don't I summarize where we are in the United States? The presidential election has pretty much devoured everything. Our political system has not yet produced federal privacy regulation. And to the extent there are debates about platform regulation, they're centered primarily on antitrust issues, with one exception. And that is, for the past 6 months, political battles have been waged on amending or repealing Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. This is the safe harbor that protects platforms from liability for user-generated content, including when platforms moderate user content. President Trump issued an executive order last spring calling on the FCC to revise Section 230. This was seen by many as punishment for Twitter labeling some of his tweets as false. And if Vice President Biden wins the election today, that executive order undoubtedly will be gone on day one. Both parties threatened to repeal, however, or revamp Section 230. The Republicans accuse social platforms of being biased against conservative voices. Democrats rail against the social platforms for not moderating more to address hate speech and disinformation online. I'm happy to elaborate on Section 230 during the Q&A if there are any questions on that topic. The Transatlantic Working Group recommended, as I mentioned, a flexible regulatory regime based on transparency and not on content regulation. And this sounds like it may be the approach coming from the European Commission and the DSA, and based on Mark's description, similar to many elements of the UK proposal. Why did we focus on transparency? It provides government with the data to develop evidence-based policies for platform oversight. It pushes companies to examine problems they would not otherwise address, and it empowers people to better control their information environment. Platforms have a First Amendment right and essentially freedom of information, of expression right rather, to design their online communities as they see fit, with their own terms of service and their community standards. This is a good thing. It promotes platform competition and diversity of voices. But they must clearly tell the user what their policies are, how they're enforced, when and why the platforms decide to delete, decelerate, or demonetize user content, or when the platform does not remove problematic speech that has been flagged. They also need to say how they resolve complaints of erroneous content moderation and how users can appeal these decisions. In our view, platforms should be required to provide statistics on moderation decisions in quarterly reports, but in a format that enables vetted researchers to compare the results with other platforms. And platforms would have to disclose to researchers and oversight bodies the impact of their algorithms, not necessarily the source code. This would include algorithms that flag items for review and those that recommend or amplify content to news feeds. Algorithms can perpetuate biases inherent in databases used to train them and amplify extremist content that drives engagement and ad views. Platforms would also be required to disclose in real time information about the funding source of political advertising, the audiences targeted, the size of the ad buy, and then also they need to maintain an archive of such ads for access by researchers. With transparency, though, there has to be accountability. Legislation should empower a regulator or other authority to draft transparency rules, to authorize independent auditing standards, rules for redress and appeals, and procedures for researchers to access information. The oversight authority could be a new or existing government agency, or it could be an independent board comprised of industry and public members. Examples of such a board are in the United States, FINRA, which regulates stockbrokers and is overseen by the Securities and Exchange Commission, or it could be the Global Network Initiative, which oversees the independent privacy and security audits of GNI member companies. There are many other examples that we can pull on. Basically, vetted researchers would analyze the disclosed information, and that information, that research would inform development and revision of evidence-based rules. It should be an iterative process. The benefits of a non-governmental oversight board are the speed with which it can move and revise rules based on evidence presented. And most importantly for me, the independence from government intrusion in platform content. Finally, I'd like to address the value of transatlantic engagement on a framework for addressing online expression. Now appears to be a golden opportunity with the European Commission working on DSA, the UK on its online harms legislation, and perhaps a new US administration and Congress. Americans and Europeans should align their platform transparency and accountability obligations, adjusting, of course, for different legal systems and for societal norms. Such cooperation would improve platform oversight. It would facilitate independent research. It would minimize costly and conflicting rules that fracture the global internet, and it would protect citizens' rights. It would help restore trust between government tech companies and the public. That trust is essential for the players to be able to work together to combat the increasingly sophisticated strategies of those who would use the internet to tear down democratic institutions. If democracies don't define a coherent set of fundamental principles and governance frameworks, the field will be defined by political powers with very different objectives. Thanks once again for having me here today.
That's great. Thanks, Susan, for that fascinating introduction. I'll now hand over to Maria to provide a European perspective. Over to you, Maria.
Thank you very much, Steve, and thank you to the IIC for organising this event today and for inviting me to speak. Just a few words about me first. My name is Maria Donde. I work with Mark at Offcom, but I'm primarily responsible for following developments in Europe and further afield in these areas. And in that role, I sit on the board of the old and very distinguished media regulators network, EPRA, in Europe. And I've also recently been fortunate enough to take on the role of chairing the Council of Europe Expert Group on Media Environment and Reform, hence my unbelievably long job title. So I've been asked, Steve's asked me to say a few words here by way of introduction about content moderation, content regulation from the perspective of European policy. I'm going to say a little bit about the interplay between content regulation and media policy in Europe and what that might mean for content moderation policy at EU level in the future, particularly in the context of the EU's fundamental rights framework. So the first thing to say is that the specific provisions for content standards, content regulatory standards in the EU are very narrow and limited, and they stem from the directive that Mark's already mentioned, the Audiovisual Media Services Directive. That originally came into force in the late 80s as the Television Without Frontiers Directive. And it's notable that that particular piece of legislation was introduced and based on the notion of broadcasting as an economic activity, and was primarily designed not to regulate content, but to help develop a single market in the then European community for television broadcasting. And it was intended to do that by harmonizing certain key areas of regulation across member states. But that harmonization included some very limited but key content-related rules, and that was around the protection of minors and the prevention of hate speech. For the first time, we had content standards at the EU level, normally something that was very much deemed to be a national level, a member state responsibility and a competence, but acknowledged as a necessary part of enabling a single market for television. And the idea was that in this marketplace of ideas and voices, there had to be some way of having a functioning exchange of ideas to make democracy and the democratic process work. That had to be based on fundamental values. And when we talk about fundamental values at the EU level, I'm sure familiar to many people, we're talking about freedom of expression, we're talking about the freedom to hold opinions, receive and impart information, but also the particular article in the Fundamental Rights Charter talks about the fact that the freedom and pluralism of the media shall be respected within this context. So media plurality in itself is seen as a vital part of that right to freedom of expression and the public's right to be informed. These are the building blocks of the European approach to content oversight. The AVMS directive itself, in fact, echoes these and says that the directive is intended to enhance compliance with fundamental rights, and in particular with Article 11. So I would say that from the European perspective, freedom of expression, media plurality, and content standards regulation are inextricably linked, and we don't really talk about one without the other. What does that mean for online content regulation in Europe now? Well, as Mark said, the new provisions around video sharing platforms, which have recently come into force, they are Europe's first foray into the oversight of online content that is not subject to editorial control. That's really critically important. But interestingly, they have emerged from the existing content standards framework that is built around this concept of editorial control, and that is essentially the media regulatory vehicle in Europe. So some might argue that this is, nevertheless, this online approach to regulation is different because it focuses on process rather than content. And that's true. It doesn't require the same kind of direct oversight as AVMS editorial providers have to exercise over content. Indeed, it can't, because video sharing platforms are protected by the limited liability framework of the e-commerce directive. But it does focus primarily on protecting users from harm resulting from encountering specific types of content which may cause them harm. New forms of regulation like this, when they're applied to non-editorial actors at an unprecedented scale of the amount of content that they're looking at as well, unless they're very carefully applied, there is a risk, which is acknowledged at the European level, that they may themselves undermine media freedom, plurality, and trust in democracy. So there are two aspects of a European approach which we will, I guess, have to see within the practical application of these new provisions. One is to focus very, very clearly on ensuring that any kind of content moderation by platforms is done within the context of that fundamental rights framework. And that is built into the VSP provisions. We're talking about rights of redress, we're talking about ensuring independent oversight, for example, which Susan also talked about just now, and also to some extent relying on that limited liability framework as well, which limits what VSPs can be obliged to do. The other aspect could be to look at additional ways to mitigate some of the harmful effects of particular types of online content, and that's effects on the individual, but also on the market, and at the same time to promote media plurality. For example, focusing perhaps less on controlling content per se and more on other aspects of what you might call media policy or digital policy, supporting mechanisms to ensure plurality and maybe even some aspects of competition regulation. A really helpful contribution to these debates comes from the Council of Europe. So, as I mentioned, I'm also involved in an expert group there, And the Council of Europe sets standards, international standards in areas within the framework of the European Convention on Human Rights. So it's looking at media policy, online policy from a human rights perspective. A really interesting document that's worth considering for those listening today is the recent recommendations on the rights and responsibilities of internet intermediaries, which asks, together with other recommendations from the Council of Europe, asks member states and platforms to focus on measures around and beside takedown. So mitigation such as support for journalism, media literacy features very, very heavily in these recommendations. And most importantly, where content moderation does come into play, on transparency, clarity, and ensuring right of redress. And the new principles for media governance and policy, which we're working on in my expert group, will continue this and develop this further. So finally, what might all of this mean for the future direction of EU policy in relation to content regulation? So before even the new AVMS directive really takes effect, the EU is already proposing a new content moderation framework through the DSA. Picking up where the AVMS directive leaves off, if you like, I think that there is likely to be a much heavier focus on content moderation as a process to make sure that it's done effectively and with respect to fundamental rights, with redress being a really, really key factor, I think, likely to be a very key factor in the DSA. And we can pick up on that again in our discussion. There will be some argument about competence, I think, with member states, particularly ones who have already gone some way down the route of establishing some content moderation frameworks in their countries. NetzDG comes to mind, the failed but probably resurgent Avia law as well in France. And the EU does tend to sort of talk about these as somewhere in the border between media and digital policy, and sees them as a fragmentation, actually, of the EU's digital policy approach. So there is a lot of pressure on the EU to make some coherent sense of all of this at the moment. And in the meantime, we also have the media industries increasingly seeing their future and their future sort of success as relying to some extent in a leveling of the playing field, let's say, and a heavier approach of regulation of online services. So this digital strategy and Digital Services Act could be a route for the EU through these challenges, stemming that tide of fragmentation, addressing problems potentially where new national rules might be not quite complying with the fundamental rights objectives themselves, and addressing this uneven playing field question. If the EU gets it right, it could be able to manage this member state competence versus EU competence and the grey area between media and digital policy. And I think if it does do that, it's probably likely to rely quite heavily on these fundamental rights, seeking to find common objectives that can be coordinated at the EU level and shared values that will be really critical to any future step towards online content regulation, which probably means moving towards that kind of more holistic Council of Europe approach, although do not quote me on that. That's all I wanted to say by way of introduction. I hope that's a helpful perspective on the European side, and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks, Maria. It's very helpful. So over to Gareth to provide a broadcaster perspective. Over to you, Gareth.
Thanks, Steve, and my thanks also to the IIC for the invitation to speak today. My name's Gareth Barr. I work for ITV. We are a global media and entertainment business with the UK's largest commercial broadcaster and also a public service broadcaster. I work in our policy and regulatory team on issues across UK government, Ofcom, and also other regulators such as the Advertising Standards Agency and the Competition and Markets Authority. So what I want to talk about today, I think two issues really. The regulation of content standards and the implications of freedom of speech, which I think is where much of the debate has been so far and is today, but also the impact of online business models on online harms, including content discovery, recommendation, dissemination and funding, which has had less attention, I think, but I think is starting to rise up people's agenda. I certainly hope it is. So let's start with content standards. In the UK and Europe more broadly, I think we do seem to have an acceptance that there are some narrow outer limits to freedom of speech. I'm not free to deny the Holocaust or to incite racial hatred or violence, and there's not a huge amount of dispute about those limits. And actually, I think it's probably an area where you can see an agreement in principle with a lot of the online platforms who, in various ways, are attempting to define their own limits, albeit often somewhat reluctantly. But the debate has shifted from not our problem to there's a limit to how much this is our problem, but we're trying our best. Where this seems to get tricky, I think, is what type of content is it that is causing concern? And how do you define this in practice and in law? Particularly, I think, when we're talking about this sort of legal but harmful content that has become the subject of hot debate in the UK here, but also I think is being pushed elsewhere, I think France perhaps. And I think we hear a lot that the online platforms want certainty, legal certainty, regulatory certainty, clearly define X as a problem and unallowable, and we will get rid of it. And I think the first thing I'd say is, as a broadcaster, we know judgments on this are hard. When does providing information on suicide or self-harm tip over into encouraging or facilitating suicide or self-harm? For platforms who didn't start out with any intent of making editorial judgments, I can understand the discomfort and the reticence. But the other thing I would say is that if you look at the broadcast system in the whole, it has largely been possible to put in place a system that allows for a degree of ambiguity. Life is not black and white. The Offcom broadcast code is, I think, a welcome framework for participants. It gives you a real sense of the sort of outcomes or negative outcomes you're trying to prevent, without prescribing exactly what they are and how you go about doing it, leaving you to adapt your business and approach accordingly, always with an eye on a common set of outcomes and protections. And the result here in the UK, at least, is a wide range of products and services. They're all designed with audience protection in mind, but with varying ways in which that's done, with varying investment in protection. ITV, the BBC, I suspect are held to somewhat higher standards and have much bigger compliance functions than some smaller operators, and I don't particularly see an issue with that. But it is clear that people worry about freedom of speech when we talk about content moderation. I mean, I'd observe, and again, cautious on today of all days, but our media is undoubtedly less partisan than what you see in the US, for example. But ITV attracts a pretty much daily attention for the sort of things that Piers Morgan says every morning on our morning programming, and it is controversial. But we are able to balance his views, to provide the context, and to have a pretty excitable debate, all within the bounds of Ofcom's rules, all in a way that allows freedom of expression, but also allows people to understand differing views, what issues are contentious. And actually, I think you can begin to see the emergence of some of this stuff online. Twitter, rather than this sort of slightly binary keep up, take down debate, are beginning to tag tweets or to provide additional information, point people to additional sources. And I think that it's interesting to see that development. I was caught by a Verizon announcement about full transparency, which is going to use blockchain to track subtle changes to legitimate media articles that are subtly changed to change their meaning, then disseminated as fake news, but are very, very hard for users to spot. So that there are, I think, things that can be done for individual pieces of content. But I do think the platforms will have to get used to a role that is slightly more like editor and publisher, and get comfortable with the ambiguity that comes with that. And there are signs of that moving in the right direction, I think. But I'll come on to later also, you do need to make sure their business models aren't actively opposing the positive outcomes we're seeing. I mean, this often is the point in the debate where people say, the scale of content online, you can't mirror what you do in TV regulation, and nor should you. It will completely shut down freedom of speech. And I think that brings me to my second theme for the day, which is this question of whether and I think we've heard a bit of this already today, whether the regulation of the activities of the platforms will reduce the scale of harm rather than just a focus on individual pieces of content often generated by users. So an individual piece of content can be harmful, of course it can, but the way in which such content can rapidly and repeatedly reach millions, billions of views almost overnight, the way in which platform algorithms deliver that, and global ad tech actively encourage and funds the creation of misinformation content, is actually a big driver of the scale of harm we're seeing. The Global Disinformation Index found that ad tech players like Google are serving up ads, providing ad revenue streams to known disinformation sites peddling coronavirus conspiracies. And that's got to be a worry. So it's not just about the content, it's why it's there in the first place, why it's profitable. I think regulation of online harms that ignores online advertising, or regulation of online advertising that only happens once it's all been published, is fighting a losing battle with the business models of many of these platforms, which are monetized to ad sales. The longer you stay, the more videos you watch, the more ads you see. I was struck by one Google engineer, much quoted now, I suspect, who says the AI isn't built to help you get you what you want, it's built to get you addicted to YouTube. And right now, the incentive is to create this type of borderline content that's very engaging but not forbidden. Why? Well, Mark Zuckerberg acknowledges that people engage disproportionately with more sensationalist and provocative content. The algorithms are not actually that sophisticated. They learn you like it, they serve you more of it. Content creators learn you like it, they make more of it, and this endless cycle continues. So I do wonder whether we can address the harm in large part not by trying to censor what people are saying, but by trying to get to grips with why that information is so widely shared and widely available. Sacha Baron Cohen so memorably put it, freedom of speech does not mean freedom of reach. And again, I think there are already signs the platforms can address this if they want to. Instagram has temporarily removed the recent tab from its hashtag pages, and it's explicitly saying we're doing this to reduce the real-time spread of potentially harmful content that could pop up around the election. So it recognises the issue and it has a tool to fix it. I do also wonder whether we need to start talking about some kind of right of freedom to hear as well as freedom of speech, because algorithmic bias and filter bubbles are undermining the benefits of free speech if all I ever hear are people that look and sound a lot like me. Even if those alternative views are out there at scale, it's no good if nobody's seeing them. So I do think an approach focused on the activities of the platforms, the actions that they are taking about driving what gets created and shared, the speed at which that happens, would allow regulators to focus on where those big issues and big harms are really being created in the first place, rather than chasing around millions and billions of pieces of individual content. Because ultimately, what we've seen online is that platforms can apply content standards if they choose to, and they can apply systemic remedies to reduce the impact and scale of harms if they choose to. And I think what we really need now is a sort of independent and statutory oversight of that to make sure that the initiatives are, as they appear, as they're claimed, are having the desired effect and are sufficiently robust given the scale and influence of major online platforms. Thank you.
Thanks, Gareth. Claire, you have the final words, at least for this stage of the process.
Well, I really want to bounce off what Gareth has just said, but let me just briefly introduce myself. I'm Claire Sumner. I'm the BBC Director of Policy, and I cover government relations, relationships with Mark and Maria in Ofcom, and also do a lot of thinking actually about, if you like, the strategic position of the BBC in the world. And one of the things that's really struck me from this conversation is I absolutely echo, and going last gives me an opportunity here to actually perhaps draw some of this together rather than just give a BBC pitch, which I'm sure, Stephen, if there was a sort of table, you'd be kicking me if I was just going on about that. So drawing out something that really struck me is this nature of this being a really global issue. And that actually we are in a totally different world that I think we just have to recognise that is actually really exciting and a real opportunity around the fact that if you get this right, you get a shared sense of endeavour. And for me, actually, this really starts with the ethos of the BBC World Service and actually, you know, speaking truth nation to nation and actually valuing what your organisation stands for. So for me, what the BBC stands for and has absolutely showed in the COVID crisis is independent, trusted news, trusted space for debate and discussion, including when there have been huge differences of opinion, but a place in the world where people can come and know that the content that they are seeing is independent and trusted. And of course, that is a model based on, and I think we can learn from the BBC model, even in this more complicated world. It's about the BBC first. The BBC has gold standard editorial guidelines, and it has been part of our culture since the 1920s. And therefore our pride in that and our organisational, if you like, endeavours absolutely stems from that. So the first challenge, and I really like the reference to whether you're a community site or the scale of your site, the first challenge is actually, what do you want to stand for? And because these platforms have perhaps come together at great speed from actually quite small ideas that have then really taken off, it's a time, I think, for all of them, and I think in fairness, some of them are doing this, to regroup and think about actually, what is our ethos and what do we stand for? And therefore, what are the principles we want to ascribe from that? Now, I'm very lucky to work at the BBC because obviously that's very clear to us. But it started with being very clear about that. And our mission to inform, educate and entertain has endured, and I hope will endure for a long time. But the point of that is that particularly around information, you have to understand the value of it, and you have to understand the damage it does when it goes wrong. And obviously, when we've looked at what this potentially does for democracies, or what this can do socially, or actually for children, then these are really big issues that as organisations we need to care about. Because if you care about them and you establish the right principles, then you've got more of a fighting chance of dealing with this. Because I absolutely agree with the point that says you can't chase in this digital world, you can't chase every individual piece of content. I think that's probably just impossible. But what you can do is set an ethos and an operating framework of how you expect and hope the majority will behave. And then for the people that don't, or actually, there are countervailing agendas and different things that people want to push. And by the time you get into illegality, I think the lines personally are pretty clear. And I think actually the policymakers in the debate is really behind the curve. I remember, for example, prosecutors in the UK talking about how do they address some of this, because actually things that had been perhaps in written media or on broadcast media or in other things, if they had been done in this way, that, they're just illegal. You don't want to incite racism. You don't want to do child pornography. These things are just illegal. And I think that part of the online content world isn't about freedom of expression. So I think we should almost, in this debate, push that to one side. Not that it's critically important, of course it is, but that is actually a clearer legal line. That the bit that's more difficult is this bit that potentially could be legal, but is really harmful. And, that's around democracy, that can be around some things around disinformation. And I think, Gareth, what you were describing. So how do you address some of those things? So transparency, Susan, as you mentioned, is really important. The BBC has very clear both editorial guidelines, but complaints frameworks, and all of this is incredibly transparent. And we have lots of audience services taking feedback all the time and responding to it. But I was thinking about this, and the other thing that is playing into the UK discussion is about the value of public service broadcasting and trusted media. And I think that part of what the platforms should be doing, and some of them have been doing this during COVID, is point to sources that are reliable and trusted and have that kind of kite mark of reliability. Because actually in this rather crazy world that we're all living in, and we're living in a global pandemic and probably going to be a global recession together, what can draw us together? And so the BBC World Service has reached over 500 million people in this period, with increasing audiences to our online sites. And why is that? Because people want reliable news. Equally, some of the responsible platforms have begun to think about public information, which of course has traditionally been seen as part of the role of organisations like the BBC, ITV and others. But actually in this period is really, really important. So if the platforms don't want to do it themselves, and by the way, they don't necessarily, because they're not content creators per se, they're hosters of varieties of different organisations, creating space which are put the media, which is trusted, into prominence is really important. And to me, Gareth, that would help address your filter bubble question, the echo chamber. How do you make sure that people have choice about actually where they go and which sources they use, rather than just be in a sort of, if you like, quite a narrow debate? How do you make sure that the power of the internet, which is supposed to be to broaden debate and to broaden experience, isn't then limited by the way that platforms operate or by the way that platforms don't operate? Because if they can choose to use quite a lot of their real estate for advertising, they could choose to link to public service broadcasting across the world. Imagine how amazing that would be, so that people could actually discover and find the content that has been through all of these processes, because user-generated content is just that and can be incredibly valuable, incredibly informative, and it's really important to maintain that freedom of expression. But traditionally, when you look at these things, there are a number of different ways that I think the regulators and the companies themselves should be considering. They can learn, I think, a great deal from what the BBC's done, what other public service broadcasters have done. But ultimately, this will only be cracked, though, I think, from the organisations themselves really thinking about the ethos and the principles that they want to do. And I think part of, Susan, the work that you've been involved in, the work that Maria was outlining in Europe, it's really interesting because when I first came to this debate, a long time in my past, I did a lot of work on human rights and the Convention of Human Rights, and the balance in the UK between and across Europe, freedom of expression and freedom of privacy. And we've moved a long way away from that debate now to actually freedom of expression in the digital world is something absolutely different. And that potentially when people drew all of this up, you know, couldn't be imagined. We're now in that world. And I think we have to approach it from a number of different angles, but you can't change culture. And this is what this is about. The culture of ways that platforms or organizations behave come from the organizations themselves. So the lesson that you would learn from the BBC, for example, is, you know, why in the 1920s did Lord Reith decide this is kind of how he was going to approach it? When you come 100 years later, that approach can still live and breathe in the digital space. But what you need to do is for freedom of expression to truly be protected, to make sure that organizations that have that at their heart are as easy as find and access as the user-generated content. It's a different approach that we should discuss, but I don't think this is about regulation by itself. I think unless you get these big tech platforms deciding how they want to operate and be, not because of political pressure, actually, in the end, it will come from user pressure. And I think that's some things that we saw during the Cambridge Analytica, that actually Facebook did have to have a bit of a think about actually how are we being perceived, and, you know, question mark as a user, you know, am I being manipulated? And here, you know, there's something particularly in the UK, which, you know, the role of the BBC, the role of the other public service broadcasters, in fairness, we do have a very well-founded media efficacy in the way that our media organisations operate. You kind of know that that's got a kite mark of quality and thought behind it, but also, you know, 10s, 20s, 30 years, you know, for the BBC, nearly 100, of deciding to operate in an ethical way that our consumers can rely on. That's more than enough for me, and hopefully not too much of a BBC pitch.
That's great, Karen, and an excellent summary. So thank you very much. So look, we'll go to questions now. And we've got quite a few questions coming in. It's possible we won't be able to answer them all. So particularly where questions are asking very specific points, we might just pick those up afterwards and send the answers out. What I might start, there's a pair of questions that I think touch on the same sets of issues, which are really, they're both about the difference, the extent to which online platforms are different from traditional broadcasts in terms of editorial control. So the first question says, would the panel agree that it is essential for freedom of expression that the internet and social media should be characterized as a vehicle for individual speech and not as a broadcast medium? So that question, I think, is emphasizing the differences between them. We've then got another question pointing out that particularly during the pandemic, online platforms have moved away from being non-editorial, and they have taken action in relation to things like WHO guidance, 5G conspiracies, NHS influence. So they have taken some editorial role. So I guess I'm just interested, is this question about, they're clearly different, some of the same principles apply to both platforms and broadcasters. I'm interested in how far that might stretch. I don't know who wants to pick that up first.
Goodness, let me go while others think.
Okay.
I'm sure I'll regret it later. So I think I'm not convinced we need to take a sort of sweeping either or approach to what we're seeing happening online. So they are unequivocally not like broadcasters. They are not commissioning people to produce content which they are paying for and then putting onto their own sites. But are they vehicles for bringing together a range of disparate views, taking decisions about which of those views they want to prioritise and push to people? Yes, and that looks very similar to what broadcasters do and what newspapers do, which is take a range of contributions and construct them into a service. So I think, you know, that there is a legitimate question about that, but I think what I'd say is focus on the harms you're seeing and try to get under the skin of what it is that is causing the harm and whether there are things you can do about it. And it may be platform specific, or it could be pan internet. You know, I don't have a firm view on the answer, but I think, you know, I come back to say what Twitter are doing. You can label content as potentially misleading. You can focus your attentions on those of your users that you think have the most influence, the greatest reach. And so what you can see is quite a different experience on Twitter, depending on who you are and your influence in the world. And I'm not sure that looks like a terrible decision from my perspective. It's causing controversy, I grant you. But you can see they're experimenting with ways in which, rather than saying, we'll ban it all, we'll take it all down, we'll censor all of this information, that they are trying to find a more nuanced way than simply leaving it all up or taking it all down. And I think that's sensible. And I do think there is, in broadcast, there has always been this concept that the more people you reach, the bigger your responsibility in terms of the way in which issues are treated and the way in which you have to be very careful about the views of third parties you carry, because of the scale of influence you can have and the expectation that comes with being a channel like ITV or BBC One. There are a set of expectations that aren't the same. And I think on platforms, I'd say the same thing, which is I do think you can reach a view that says this is not about saying everybody should have their views censored. It's not possible anyway. But it is about saying for those people that reach 1 billion people a day, have 1 billion followers, there may well be A, more responsibility on those users, and B, more responsibility on the platforms to get to grips with the impact of those users and the impact of the behaviours of the platforms in pushing that information at people, as opposed to the right of those people to say things.
Anyone else? Actually, I might ask Susan if there's a US perspective on this distinction.
First of all, a friend once said that the expressions on the internet are more like a walk in Times Square than the New York Times. So I agree wholeheartedly. It is not media in the traditional sense. I also agree with some statements that Claire was making with respect to platforms developing their principles. What do we stand for? And then reflecting those principles in their terms of service and how they enforce those terms of service, how they deal with their users, how they deal with the public. Also note that technology is constantly changing. These platforms are constantly evolving. And again, I agree with Claire that they respond very directly to user pressure. And we've seen that on countless occasions where they've changed their policies based on the pressure that's been brought to bear both by their users as well as their advertisers. So things are constantly in a state of flux, and I think that's good. And then fourth, we focus on platforms and we rail against the dissemination of conspiracy theories and the like, particularly in the United States right now. But I would also point out it's been a combination, not just of platforms, but traditional media that has played a major role in that. For example, if you've been in the United States, you're familiar with the talk radio that is essentially all very right-wing. And the conspiracy theories, including all the stuff about was President Obama born an American citizen, or was he foreign born? Those kinds of things have a very happy home. And what those who wish to do harm to democracy, who wish to do harm to our institutions, what they do is they flip back and forth between foreign sources, domestic sources, online media that pick up some of these lead themes, and then platforms that also promote them. And I also agree with some statements Gareth was just making, that platforms are now learning to put friction into the system where they see that harmful content is spreading more rapidly, to give some time to determine how to address it. So I think things are evolving very rapidly, but no, they're not media in the traditional sense.
Thanks, Susan. Does anyone else want to come in on this one? Go on, John.
Very, very briefly, which is, I think that's absolutely right. I think it goes back, though, to the fundamental point about, actually, it's about information, and whatever platform, broadcast, newspaper, or whoever you're running it, has got to take some responsibility as to how that then kind of comes together. And I do think there are some green shoots, but I do think that actually more of it needs to come from them.
Thanks. Let me ask another question. If I think about the sort of traditional way we frame regulation, we talk about a number of different concepts. We talk about accuracy, we talk about impartiality, we talk about plurality, we talk about transparency. If like there are a range of different tools that people talk about as being important, actually particularly when you're thinking about news, where you're cautious about a regulator saying what the answer is, cautious to say the least, actually. I'm just curious from the different panelists as to which of those tools feels most appropriate going forward. And I guess a particular question within that, I've always struggled with this question of what impartiality really is, because my view is we don't actually make broadcasters be impartial. We actually just try and make sure they express a plurality of views. So what is the difference, if you like? Is impartiality still a relevant concept going forward? And what other concepts are most important when we deal with online platforms? And I might start with Maria, because you introduced that range of terms.
Yeah, if it's okay, I'm going to answer the first of your questions and carefully avoid the second, because we could really be here for a very, very, very long time discussing that particular issue. But in terms of the tools and the toolbox and the toolkit available, I think almost kind of coming back to the previous question, but I will draw this together. We sort of started talking about our platforms editorial actors or not, and I think sometimes, while that is a very interesting and a really valid and important discussion, I think it distracts from a slightly different discussion which we could usefully have, which is about objectives and shared outcomes. Actually, both Claire and Gareth mentioned that when they made their introductory comments, and I heard both of them saying it quite often, and it really stuck with me as well. If we identify and agree on a set of objectives and outcomes that we want to achieve, then it becomes really, really clear that we're talking about numerous actors in this space. It's not just about platforms and regulators. It's not just about platforms and media. It's also about users. And so when you see all of those actors as relevant to the outcomes that you want to achieve, then you start to sort of expand your toolkit. And I know, Steve, we've also discussed this in the past, but I do stress that media literacy is really important here. And it's important here not because as a means of just shoving off responsibility onto users, both to grow resilience in relation to the content that they see, but also to actually increasingly be responsible content producers themselves. But also because of the responsibility that institutions have to ensure that people are media literate, that they are properly empowered and properly supported. Now, that responsibility can be shared very, very widely. Some people feel that platforms should be taking greater responsibility in that area. Others feel that it's really up to educators and up to governments to have a kind of holistic strategy around that. But I do think media literacy is really, really important. The other sort of aspects, I suppose, and this is where you start to look at this as a kind of, is this a media policy issue? Is about, if you want to address disinformation, and this really is I think what I would call a European perspective. If you want to address disinformation, yes, to some extent it's about the content itself, but it's also about ensuring that trustworthy media is both visible, is recognizable, and is sustainable. Because this is perhaps more a subject for Susan, but in particular, as a global question, local news media is shutting down. Local news media is shutting down in the UK. Newspapers, traditional legacy media. There is a shrinking of that space. And we see that all over the place, and those are the sorts of things that need to be, I guess, supported and also looked at when you talk about how to tackle disinformation, which are very far from how to regulate platforms. So that's I'm not sure if I've picked ones which I think are particularly important, but those two, that kind of plurality and media literacy aspect, I think is really critical.
Okay, does anybody else want to come in on this one?
You want me to try and have a little bit of a go at your second question? I mean, to answer your first question, actually, they're all important for different reasons. And this could be the subject, Steve, those questions would be the subject for the rest of the panel and the rest of the session. But I think when you're thinking about impartiality in a BBC context, what you're thinking about is actually no polarization. And that you leave your subjectivity, you leave any political persuasions, or if you like, your baggage at the door, and you come into work, and what you're really trying to do on the audience's behalf is probe and, if you like, interrogate a range of different views so that the audience can decide. So Susan referred to, and we're very aware of this, the polarization of media in the States. I guess in the UK, the BBC, ITV, and even some of the newspapers would say actually their primary role is to kind of inform, show the range of views, show the debate, and then enable the audience to make their own judgment, as opposed to coming at it with a particular angle or view, which then in effect means that you kind of unconsciously then perhaps bias the discussion. So it's really to take that bias out of the system, which is something slightly different to sort of balancing views on the one hand or on the other hand. So in terms of, for me, where plurality is important, you could have plurality with a group of media providers who all come from the right in the States. Let's use that as the example. That is not the same as having plurality in terms of choice for the consumer, which I was talking about, which is, if you like, to Maria's point, having almost kite-marked organisations that you know what you're getting from there, and you have an opportunity as a consumer to go out of your bubble. I mean, one of the things that the Ofcom reports in the UK have shown is that a lot of people may look at social media or may look at these platforms, but then they come back to what they regard as reliable sources to check against what they are being told. At the moment, the platforms don't really necessarily facilitate those journeys. And I think that is a real question for us to think about. So for me, impartiality is a core thing, but impartiality also means you can have independence, independent from political persuasion, commercial biases, or different types of pressure. So the other thing you don't get at the BBC is what I call omission reporting, where perhaps you don't report something because X commercial interest or Y commercial interest doesn't want you to do that. And then I think finally, sitting at the heart of all of this is really a question about accuracy. And I think accuracy versus opinion is a really important part of this debate, because a lot of user-generated content by its nature will be opinion and it will be subjective. And therefore, how it's presented as such in the online space, if we're in a debating forum, then that's all very clear. Once people start to try and manipulate that and do use news brands and various other things to do so, then you're moving into a different space. And understanding that, so media literacy, I agree with Maria on, and we do a lot about this both in the UK and globally, so that people can understand actually what are they seeing and what are they looking at, so that they can then begin to make the judgments for themselves. So that's where I would come out, Stephen. I don't know if that helps you or not, but that's where I would come out.
It does. It's good to know where you come out. Does anybody else want to pick up? Susan, go.
On the question of impartiality, it is almost impossible to require that. Certainly, if a platform chooses to go in that direction, that's fine. But we have seen the pressures in the United States back and forth against, for example, Facebook and Twitter primarily, with the charge that they are discriminating against conservatives. We had an article in today's Washington Post, which provided evidence and research in the exact opposite direction, that these platforms have responded to the bullying by the administration and have bent over backwards to, in many instances, favor the conservative viewpoints. So it goes back and forth. But frankly, the consumers can figure out what it is they want to be receiving. Your media literacy will make a big difference in that respect, that they know that there are viewpoints that may be implicated by the algorithms that dictate what they see. There certainly is additional pressure that could be brought to bear for platforms to provide some user choice as to what that interface is, whether they want it to be determined by the platform in its normal course, or whether they want it to be chronologically delivered in their news feed, whether they only want to see certain types of information in the news feed, etc. So they're introducing more consumer choice would be helpful. But at the same time, we see, for example, conservatives in the United States have started a couple of social media platforms, one called Parlay or Parler, that is intended to be a lively place for conservative commentary. You have other places that will not be, more likely than not, be regulated because they're smaller than the thresholds that most of the governments are looking at. And those would be things like 4chan and 8chan, which are hotbeds of disinformation. So we need to be thinking about that. And then also private sector is wonderful at coming up with ideas, one of which NewsGuard, for example, many of you are familiar with in Europe, which does rank on reliability various forms of news information so that users can determine what they want to see. One other thing that I would point out very quickly, one of the things that we discuss in our report is what we call ABC of disinformation. The ABCs: actors, behavior versus content. The bad actors, finding them and addressing them, the bad behavior. It's that coordinated and authentic campaigns that they run oftentimes across platforms, versus looking at specific pieces of content. And the more we can get platforms, government, and the public to be working together to sort that out, that does make a difference. But thinking about it in those terms, rather than the actual content itself, is helpful.
Thanks, Susan. There were 2 or 3 questions that have come in that are, I suppose, broadly about questions of jurisdiction, which I maybe will put to Mark. I mean, so there's a question about how, how does a UK-based authority deal with stuff that originates internationally? There's actually another question, essentially the same question, but in relation to Southeast Europe. If you're sitting in Southeast Europe, what do you do about content that is not within your jurisdiction? And I guess, and there's a related point as to, under what circumstances do you end up having to block domains, block links, essentially go after the pipes rather than rely on being able to work with the originator of the content? And I realise there's no easy answer to that one, but Mark, over to you.
Yes, thanks for that, Steve. Yeah, look, these are tricky questions. In the government's proposals and in the powers related to video sharing platform regulation, in extremis, the intention is that the regulator would have the power to work with partners to disrupt the business of platforms that were systematically in breach of regulations and posing an excessive risk to their consumers. That could, in extremis, include ISPs being asked to block access to certain domains. There's no perfect solution, even if you have established a case that you think a particular service is in such egregious breach of the requirements that it needs to be blocked. There's no way of completely preventing access to it, but those sorts of tools are available. I think the thing that I would say about that is, those really would be powers that would be reserved for very exceptional circumstances. It's clearly not a part of the policy intent here to end up in a situation where we have a very sort of balkanized internet with extensive blocking of services. So more sort of constructively, I think there's a big role here for coordination between regulators, particularly within Europe, where despite Brexit, obviously there is a long tradition of cooperation between different regulatory authorities, and we continue to have good links to regulators in other parts of Europe. I think that there's opportunities for collaboration at the kind of enforcement end of the spectrum, and to be working together to try to take action where it's necessary to do so. I think there's also room for cooperation at the policy development end of the process as well. So the more that we can start to work towards having common standards for things like transparency or complaint and redress mechanisms, oversight and governance processes, I think the more opportunity there is for platforms to be held to a common set of standards, not necessarily content standards, because they will differ from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but procedural standards. It seems to me there's scope for quite a lot of collaboration on, and I think that's probably the most fruitful area to explore. We'll see where we get to in the UK, but I suspect being in a position where we feel the appropriate solution is to try to prevent access entirely to a service, that feels like a pretty uncomfortable place for a regulator to be.
I don't know if anybody else wants to come in on this one. Feels a fairly compelling response, actually. But on this question, so go on, Maria, go on.
I was just going to point very briefly to the development of the terrorist content regulation at EU level, which might, just on a practical sense in terms of the questions from our viewers today, might be something that's worth taking a look at. Now, that's still under negotiation. It's not been agreed, and would need time to come into force anyway. But it has within it a framework of designated authorities who would have the power to issue notices for takedowns of particular types of very, very egregious content. So just from a very, very practical perspective, that might be something to look at for those who are interested in possible models. Thank you.
Thanks. On this question, I guess I'm interested in this question of clearly it's great to cooperate. You don't have to agree on everything in order to be able to cooperate. There is a big question about attitudes to freedom of expression. So one of the questions that has come in notes there are different versions of freedom of expression. So there's the sort of US First Amendment, there's the European Court of Human Rights, there's the UN view of what freedom of expression is. I guess my question to the panelists is, are these close enough to allow international cooperation, or are there sufficiently material differences, I guess, particularly between the US and Europe in the way we think about freedom of expression, to make that cooperation difficult? I'll probably start with Susan on this one, but anybody else feel free to.
Thank you. Yes, there are differences between our First Amendment rights and the fundamental rights in Europe of freedom of expression and right to receive information. For us, the focus is primarily on government, preventing government from taking action. And that what we have seen of late is an important element that keeps on giving in the United States, frankly. So I happen to be a big promoter of that aspect of First Amendment. But that having been said, I think there is a lot of commonality in how we view things. Increasingly in the United States, we are becoming a little more willing to have a balancing of rights, which is fundamental within Europe. And so with privacy and some other things, certainly the public has generally agreed that certain things are egregious and outside the protections of First Amendment, and that including child pornography and incitement to violence and the like. So those are areas where we are increasingly coming together. But I think certainly, once again, because our platforms have a First Amendment right to form their own principles, their own terms of service and the like, we can get them to be working more cooperatively across the Atlantic with democracies to further those fundamental values. I don't have a problem with that at all.
Anyone else wants to come in on this question of international cooperation, particularly on this question of consistency of approaches to freedom of expression?
I can say a word or two, I guess. I wanted just to quote something actually, which I read, which is a comment from the French digital minister, who recently, Cedric O, who said that France would like to see an obligation on content moderation at the EU level, with an EU regulator, by the way, but that the definition of what constitutes illegal speech should be left to member states. Each country has its own definition of free expression and online hate speech. And when you read statements like that, I think it can be quite challenging, and it can sometimes be a bit depressing if you are involved in multilateralism and cross-border cooperation, as many of us are. And I agree very strongly with Susan that this is absolutely an opportunity, a time for our governments and our policymakers to try to find common ground in this area. But when you are involved in this, it can sometimes be a bit depressing, because when you start getting into the real nitty-gritty of content standards and different types of approaches to defining illegal speech and defining harm, and so on, it can become very, very fragmented very quickly. So I suppose that the only thing to say is that you're going to have to find some areas of compromise depending on what it is that you want to achieve, and again, focusing on objectives, on outcomes and principles is helpful here. And then if you can all agree on those, then some countries might be a bit more willing to make compromises. But it will of course depend on those shared fundamental values and whether or not those are indeed shared. And I also think that there's a bit of a risk when we start to talk about content, when we really focus so hard about the actual content, because even with something as egregious as child pornography, or rather sort of child sexual abuse content, the definition of what is a child is different in different countries as well. So you're still going to come up against these types of problems. So therefore, arguably focusing on some of the more structural and process type approaches might potentially bring some more positive outcomes. But it's something we have to continue to discuss and talk about and try to work on, because ultimately these sorts of things are going to have to be global solutions, I think.
Very quickly, I think what's interesting to me listening to the debate today and looking at the questions we're getting is that it seems you can pretty quickly get to a pretty common list of concerns and priorities the balance people place on each of those will be different by jurisdiction, but actually there's agreement about the things and issues we should be working through. And I do wonder whether, back to one of your earlier questions, Steve, if you have transparency about the outcomes that we are seeing, if we have a common set of measures, metrics and standards that allow us to describe what we are seeing accurately and allow people to understand what's happening, and if we can have openness about the practical tools that are available and the impact that has on all the varying different things you might be wanting to measure, what you then almost end up with is sort of a toolkit whereby they may have to get used to slightly differing rules in different places and taking different actions in different places depending on what they're seeing. But it's striking that they can do that. You know, you've seen WhatsApp prevent mass sharing of information in India. It's possible. Whether it's desirable, I'm not making a judgment on, but what you then have is at least a common expression. We can all have the same debate, we can learn from each other, we're going to have labeling of content, and you see what happens. And in the end, that might just be a slightly more experimental way through to a sort of consolidated framework based on actually giving it a go and seeing what works and what doesn't, and allow us to sort of walk through this in stages instead of trying to design an optimal system for the entire globe before we do anything, which I just don't think is practical.
Okay, thanks, Gareth. We're close to the end. I just wondered, I might just quickly go around the panel to see if anybody wants to, any closing remarks as to, what should we all be doing next? What should we be looking for our governments to do next? I mean, just whatever you feel like you want to say. And I don't know, I might start with Claire because you're at that point in my screen.
So I think what we should be doing next is actually taking a step back and not giving ourselves lots of excuses, because this debate's been going on for a long time, and I do worry about that. It's been going on for a long time without much action. So from the BBC's perspective, we are going to keep on keeping on. And I think that's what the world wants us to do. So we're going to keep on keeping on. But I think there is a broader policy question. And actually, like Maria, I was a bit despondent when we said, OK, well, there's different definitions of freedom of expression. And I suspect all of us have been policymakers or involved in those. And it's fascinating individually, but it's actually not the point. The point is that we have to find those broad principles that I spoke about earlier. And I think that's the next step of action, to actually, there's a lot of agreement about that. So let the platforms then come up with those. They're going to be different for different platforms in different situations. And then I think Gareth is right. I think experiment. But I actually think that there's a danger that the policy debate, the longer this goes on for, the longer there's a lack of action, or action only when the user voice gets so loud, or perhaps the legislative voice gets so loud. I think actually there should be more of a urgency amongst platforms to get on with this, to try and put some sensible principles in place, and then for the regulatory frameworks also to be developed quickly. And let's iterate and learn. Let's go digital. Let's go agile, flexible and fast.
Thanks, Claire. Mark, you're next in my gallery.
Thanks, Steve, and thanks everybody for a really interesting discussion and some very good challenging questions in the Q&A. I mean, I think the main theme for me actually that's run through this is we'll make more progress better and more easily in terms of international cooperation if we think about the challenge less in terms of how we enforce some set of kind of universal content standards on the enormously diverse panoply of online services and platforms, and instead take a rather more forensic approach to identifying where harm arises from the ways that users use online platforms, and develop targeted strategies to try to deal with those problems, rather in the way that Claire was describing, in a much more agile and flexible way. Now, we've got to do that in a way that also gives users certainty about what they can expect, and platform certainty about what the regulatory requirements are. But I think part of the challenge here is that when we have the debate in a very abstract way at the level of broad principles, it's quite hard to get specific about what needs to change and why. And I think, as you know, certainly in the UK, we start moving forward with regulating in some of these areas, and then I hope we'll be able to take a much more granular approach to identifying where the problems arise and what can be done about them. and to work internationally where it's appropriate and possible to do that.
Thanks, Mark. Maria, you're next.
I'm not going to add anything to. I think I closed on a sort of a hopeful note about global cooperation. So I'll leave you with that thought. Thank you so much for the really excellent discussion, though, to everyone, to all the speakers, and to Steve. Thanks.
Gareth, did you want to add anything?
I echo what Claire says. Actually, we need a framework introduced to empower an independent regulator to set some broad principles and to set the platforms on their way to addressing them and providing solutions to their unique implementations, and with the regulator with the ability to measure the outcomes of those and take action where needed.
And Susan, is there anything you want to add before you get back to real life Washington?
Basically, just to encourage the public, policymakers, and the platforms on a transatlantic basis or with democracies to be working together on developing transparency rules of the road, to developing protocols for research, to developing protocols for independent audits, and whatever other oversight standards. This could be going on right now. I'd love to see with a new administration, if we have one in the United States, that it reaches out to the Europeans, to the British as well, to participate in the development of these protocols and standards and plans, because I think then we're going to start to all be moving in the same direction. There's a great start right now, but we can accelerate the process in that fashion. So thank you again for including me in the conversation.
Well, thanks, Susan, and we were holding our breath for you, I think. Thank you to all of our panelists. I've really enjoyed the discussion. It's been absolutely fascinating. We'll finish now. We will try and pick up any other questions we haven't answered subsequently. Bye now.